in 2004, I wrote The Vitamin D Paradigm Shift, and I'll provide you a copy of that if you haven't already seen it. So right now, I'm going to use my own acronym for studying pharmacology. We're going to talk about function, administration, cautions, interactions, laboratory testing, and any other details on top of that. So that's the way that I describe and have structured my presentation on pharmacology. I call it the Facile Pharmacology acronym. And thanks again to all of the paid subscribers. Otherwise, I'd be doing something else. But because of your commitment, I likewise return that commitment by talking about new stuff or reviewing stuff that I've talked about before, in this case, a little bit of both. So let's talk about the pharmacology of vitamin D, starting with functions. So you have a nuclear vitamin D receptor. You also have a membrane vitamin D receptor, especially in the brain. Everybody knows that vitamin D participates in calcium absorption and calcium balance to some extent. So let me give you an example of both of those. So in the gut, vitamin D promotes the absorption of calcium. However, when the body has sufficient calcium, then that lowers parathyroid hormone levels. And when parathyroid hormone levels are lower, that changes the intracellular, extracellular balance of calcium ions, and that has a huge impact on metabolism and inflammatory balance and things like that. So another way of saying that is that the quantitative difference or the quantitative impact that vitamin D has on calcium balance becomes a qualitative metabolic distinction, let's say, because as I already said, let me say it in reverse this time. When people are vitamin D deficient, they are not absorbing calcium as they should. Because of that, the body compensates by increasing the excretion of parathyroid hormone. When that happens, that's a kind of a desperate attempt by the body to maintain serum calcium levels. And that's where most people live most of the time, in a state of either, you could call it compensation or you could call it reasonably decompensation, because it is a pathological state. When parathyroid hormone levels elevate to maintain serum calcium, that not only maintains the level of serum calcium, but it changes the intracellular balance of calcium as well to raise intracellular calcium levels. When that happens, that changes gene expression. So the balance of calcium, which is affected by many different things, one of the most important is vitamin D. The other really important thing is kind of systemic acid-base balance, pH, which you can measure. I've talked about this, and I've written about it for years, but I've talked about this before if you look at my videos on urine pH. That also changes calcium balance, and when we change calcium balance, we change the intracellular content of calcium. When we do that, that affects gene expression and inflammatory balance. So that's, one way of looking at vitamin D to understand its importance. Let's see. Let me just reintroduce something, because I did a separate introduction to this video, but I think now in the kind of cleaner version, I haven't explained why I have this exhaust fan on in the back, and that's because we got new floors finally, and that means I painted the baseboards, and that means it kind of smells like paint in here, so that's why I have a fan on in the background. Anyway, that's just some background information. Vitamin D, as I state here, also plays a role, I already kind of said this in a way, in immunomodulation. It's anti-inflammatory, counteracts intracellular hypercalcinosis. That's a phrase that I coined back in 2006. I published an article on that. And it's an important concept. Intracellular hypercalcinosis is a pathologic state, pathophysiologic state. Vitamin D improves and protects the brain. It has an antidepressant role, an anti-anxiety role, improves gut function barriers and the microbiome. Oh, and so here's what I added just a few days ago to give you another kind of perspective on vitamin D. So like the old way of looking at vitamin D is that, it just helps you absorb calcium and that makes your bones stronger. I mean, come on. Anybody who limits their conversation to that these days is just completely out of touch. Variously described, as I state here, almost 3,000 DNA binding sites for the vitamin D receptor. So vitamin D has a massive impact on human gene expression, a significant effect on the activity of more than 200 genes, which is at least 3%, and it's way more than that. But let's just say 3% of the human genome. So here's something I want to say. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I'm just it's a little bit hearsay. But I think at one point I heard that like the difference between a human being and a chimpanzee was only like 1% of the genome or something like that. So if so let's just assume for the sake of conversation, maybe that's true. I'll have to look it up. But if only 1% of the genome is different between a human and a chimpanzee, then put that in perspective. If 3% of your genome is impacted or regulated by vitamin D, I mean, that's just huge. I mean, look at the difference between you and a chimpanzee. For some humans, it's a huge difference. So anyway, moving on from that, administration. Yeah, so for kids, and I said this back in the article back in 2004. A really important article was published on The Lancet. This was a life-changing, paradigm-shifting article published on The Lancet by Hipponen and his or her group from Sweden, I believe. This was a 30-year study with more than 10,000 kids, and they gave those kids, and they were all they were infants. I describe them here as children, but they were, more accurately, they were infants, less than 1 year of age. And they got 2,000 international units of vitamin D and had I think it was a 78% reduction in type 1 diabetes. For adults, we could typically use 4,000 to 10,000 international units, assuming that they don't have sarcoidosis, tuberculosis, Crohn's disease, or they're not taking hydrochlorothiazide. So those are all risk factors for developing hypercalcemia. I've discussed that before in my review article that I'll provide you access to. Interactions, again, interactions with drugs and disease. So sarcoidosis, tuberculosis, and Crohn's disease, those are called granulomatous diseases. Some types of leukemia, lymphoma should also be on that list. Granulomatous diseases increase the risk for developing hypercalcemia. So does hydrochlorothiazide. I've only seen that in one patient, but it was enough to make me concerned. Deficiency of vitamin D is promoted by inflammation, infection, steroids, anti-seizure drugs, and magnesium deficiency. So a lot of people are deficient in magnesium, usually about 70% of the population, and that's even by some kind of loose criteria. The conversation there is that you have to have magnesium in order to properly metabolize vitamin D, but you also have to have vitamin D to properly absorb magnesium. So obviously that can result in a vicious cycle. Lab tests monitor for hypercalcemia every once in a while. 25-hydroxyvitamin D3 is the test for measuring vitamin D levels, and we want that optimized in most people between 50 and 90 nanograms per milliliter. Again, that's for most people who don't meet some of our concerns and contraindications listed above. A few other comments. This should be routine use. No controversy here. No controversy for anybody who can actually read, unless you're one of the 16,000 people in the Endocrine Society, because the Endocrine Society, as a professional organization, mostly of physicians and endocrinologists, they can't figure out what the fuck to do with vitamin D. And they state in their 2024 guidelines that vitamin D is such a confusing topic, we shouldn't even do the lab test for it, because we don't know how to interpret the lab tests. That is from a professional organization with 16,000 members, and in 2024, which was a solid 23 years, 20 years is what I should have said. That was a solid 20 years after I wrote the vitamin D paradigm. And now they're saying, oh, well, we don't know how to measure vitamin D levels, and if we measured them, we wouldn't know how to interpret them. And even if we could interpret them, we wouldn't know what to do with them. That is the epitome of medical stupidity for strategic purposes. And I'll show you I'll show you why on one of the upcoming slides. In fact, I'll show it to you on this slide. So this is a slide I made back in 2021. The constellation of vitamin D impact on inflammation, hypercoagulation, and immunomodulation. So in one image, conceptual image, obviously. This explains to you why the medical profession can't fucking figure out vitamin D to save their fucking lives, right? They can't figure it out. They fuck up the research. Every commentary in a big journal, like in JAMA or something like that, is going to say, well, we don't know what to do about vitamin D. It's controversial. It's controversial because they publish crap and they don't know how to read. They don't know how to read, period, let alone read research to any level of detail. But what I've shown you in this diagram, which is excerpted from one of my videos, so if you want to see the context for this conversation, look on my blog for the vitamin D gold mine, and you'll see where this came from. I think this was video number 5. So this image, as I already started to say, this explains the importance of vitamin D. And when we understand the importance of vitamin D, you'll also therefore understand why the medical profession has to bullshit every conversation about vitamin D, because vitamin D is so important for the human body that if people had adequate vitamin D, they wouldn't need so many anti-inflammatory drugs, analgesic drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressant drugs, antihypertensive drugs, anti-cancer drugs. I mean, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar drug market that is sustained by keeping the population deficient in vitamin D. And so that's why they can never understand it. The Endocrine Society says, well, we don't know how to test for vitamin D deficiency, and even if we knew how to test for it, we wouldn't know how to treat it. Well, look, I wrote the vitamin D paradigm shift in 2004. From start to finish, I was invited by the journal to write the article. From start to finish, I wrote that whole article in 10 days. Without any support. It's not like I was in some academic center, with a bunch of faculty and staff collaborating on this document. No, I wrote the damn thing in 10 days. Gil Manso, here's the other thing. So this was before I went to medical school. I went to medical school starting in 2006. I wrote this article in 2004. So in order for this article to qualify for continuing medical education, they said I had to have a medical doctor as a co-author. Well, so I got Gil Manso to sign off on it. Gil Manso and I worked together in the same office for about 6 years. It was his office, and I'm forever grateful that he let me work with him. He was a good doctor, a lot of experience, some radical ideas at times, and he helped me immensely in my life for getting into medical school and all these kinds of things. So anyway, he said, yeah, I'll sign my name to it. But he didn't do anything. John Cannell, literally at the last minute. So like I said, I wrote the whole thing within about 10 days. After I wrote it, I sent it to John Cannell, who's a medical doctor. I think he's a psychiatrist. And he's the president of the Vitamin D Council. So he's a vitamin D expert. So I sent it to him. I said, hey, take a look at it. He said, well, you didn't talk about diabetes and hypertension. And I said, no, I ran out of time. I said I had to do the whole damn thing in 10 days. So he said, I'll write the 2 paragraphs on vitamin D and hypertension and diabetes. So that's what he did. And the other thing that he did, I wanted to push for a more radical, higher level for vitamin D optimization. He said, no, he said, if you're too progressive with this, people will reject it because they're not ready for it. He said, you can be right, but you also have to write something that, the population can accept with this current level of knowledge and ignorance. So I was like, okay, I'll compromise. So I think I wanted to say the optimal range should be 50, which is what I have said since then. But I think we compromised at the time and we just said 45. We'll look at that in just a moment. Anyway, going back to this diagram before I move on. Vitamin D impacts, and in a certain sense, we could say controls 3% of the human genome. So it's of major importance. Because of that, when people are vitamin D deficient, which is the reality for 70% of the human population, let's say, they're chronically dysfunctional and sick. And for that reason, they are a profit center for the medical drug cartel. And for that reason, the medical drug cartel wants to protect its market by keeping people vitamin D deficient. So I'm going to read everything on the page here. So vitamin D has an important impact on controlling inflammation, coagulation, metabolism, mitochondria, therefore obesity, insulin resistance, diabetes, cellular defense against infections, defense in terms of barriers as well. I'll show you that on the next page. The elaboration of certain antimicrobial proteins. Also, again, immune balance. So immunity and inflammation are obviously connected, but they're obviously different as well. So we can reasonably state for the past 21 years, we can state that vitamin D has an anti-inflammatory effect. That's true, but it also affects immune balance, and that's connected to but different from inflammation. So that's why I say here immune tolerance. As I stated before, vitamin D also plays a role in the deficiency or synergy with other nutrients such as magnesium. Apparently magnesium, apparently also selenium, and I would also state probably, I think we'll eventually see, I think eventually the research will show that vitamin D plays a role in the metabolism of lithium as well. Vitamin D impacts the microbiome in a way that's actually quite interesting. Maybe I'll talk about that in just a moment before I get off this page. Psychosocial, again, when people are vitamin D deficient, they become more depressed and more anxious. Chemical and metal toxicity in this exact moment, I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote that, other than to just kind of claim perhaps that vitamin D, through its neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory roles, would kind of indirectly support a person against the toxicity of chemicals and metals. Messengers and hormones, as I stated before, intracellular calcium is considered, it's a classic example of a second messenger. One that actually promotes disease, dysfunction, cancer, inflammation, insulin resistance, hypertension. So when we optimize vitamin D status, we're also pushing in the direction of optimizing intracellular calcium balance. Obviously other things are at play there as well. And as I already said, neuroinflammation is a component of many different problems: anxiety, depression, addiction, alcoholism, depression and anxiety, but also food intake and metabolic balance as specifically related to diabetes, obesity, and insulin resistance. So again, with vitamin D, we can control to some extent neuroinflammation, or we can modulate it, and that has effects throughout the body. So again, the more you appreciate the value and the roles of vitamin D, the more you'll appreciate why the medical profession wants to be ignorant of these topics, because they don't want to give you an inexpensive, unpatentable, uncontrollable option that makes your entire health better. And that's before, as I show you on this page, and that's before we even talk about the amazing impact of vitamin D against acute viral infections, especially COVID. So, as I showed you here in this slide, this was back in 2021, I think. Yeah, 2021. Vitamin D has a remarkable impact in improving inflammatory balance, immune balance, barrier defense against infections, and immune function in general, and also recovery from infectious diseases. So when you talk about an infectious disease, like I state here, and this is the model that I created back in 2014 when I wrote the book on it, Antiviral Nutrition, any given infection has at least four main components, and you're looking at them here. Acquisition, replication, immunonutrition, or immune function per se, and cellular impact, systemic impact, and recovery from the infection. And vitamin D plays a major role in improving all of those. That's why in the clinical trials using vitamin D, we saw 70 to 80% literal salvation of these acute COVID patients. Well, what's the medical profession going to do in response to such a miraculous and inexpensive benefit? They are going to, of course, blacklist vitamin D. I'll show you that in just a moment. So let me go back one aspect. So here's the vitamin D paradigm shift that I wrote back in 2004. I'll provide you a copy of that. Here's the optimal range that I published in 2011. Again, pushing back up to at least 50 or at least 125 nanograms per, nanomoles per liter. I need to check that and make sure that's correct. So here, this was in 2021, more or less, at the end of 2020. This is when I wrote this, or kind of constructed this infographic on the optimal serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D level. Again, starting at 50 nanograms per milliliter, which again, confirming, is 125 nanomoles per liter. I have to look around my camera just to make sure I'm reading that correctly. I'll provide you these images on the website. So again, 2020, 2021, I wrote a few articles. You can get this one online for free. Vitamin D pharmacology infographic. I'm going to show you these graphics in just a moment. Physiologic dosing, which means daily or weekly dosing, versus bolus dosing, which is what the medical profession wants to do. So let's see what this shows us. So this is what you would expect. With physiologic dosing of vitamin D, 5,000 international units per day, you get a gradual increase in the active, biologically important form of vitamin D, which is 25-hydroxyvitamin D. Some of you will disagree with what I just said because you don't know and you don't understand the pharmacology of vitamin D. Because what I just said is the reverse of what most people are taught about vitamin D. Everybody is taught that the active form of vitamin D is 125-dihydroxyvitamin D3, and that is not correct. That is the pharmacologically more potent form, but it exists in nanomolar amounts, or microscopic amounts, let's say. In contrast, you have more 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and so even though it's pharmacologically weaker, you have so much more of it that it accounts for 80% of the biologic activity at the vitamin D receptor. So 25-hydroxyvitamin D is the measurement marker, let's say, of vitamin D, but it's also 80% of the activity. So it's not just an indirect or surrogate marker. It is your vitamin D status. If you double the dose of vitamin D from 5,000 units to 10,000 units, then you only get a slight, you'll notice that it's kind of plateauing, you get a slight increase in 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels. Normalization of PTH occurs at, as I've said before, 32 and 80, as you can see on this page. So either way you look at it, with 5,000 international units per day, you're normalizing most people. You're not optimizing them, you're normalizing them. And with 10,000 units, you get a little higher. And that's probably more advisable. Now, that's doing it right. So let me go back. I'll just show you what's doing it right. This is doing it right. Now let's look at how the medical profession does it, because they do it wrong. What you'll see in a lot of studies in the medical world, when they're trying to make vitamin D look ineffective, the strategy that they use is called bolus dosing. Bolus dosing means giving a huge dose, either 100,000 units, 200,000 units, or 600,000 units, because they think that, oh, well, it's a fat-soluble nutrient, so we'll just give you a lot of it, and it'll stay in your body. Well, here's how it stays in your body. First of all, it doesn't stay in your body. What you get with bolus dosing is, as I've shown you here, you get a dramatic spike in vitamin D3 levels. When you give a bolus dose of vitamin D3, you get a spike in vitamin D3 levels, first in the blood and then in the adipose tissue, where it remains biologically active for months, but it's not being converted into the active form, which is 25-hydroxyvitamin D. Well, for those of you who know about pharmacology, you would reasonably expect that vitamin D3 could have a little bit of activity at the receptor. So let's call this the vitamin D receptor, whether it's nuclear or in the membrane, or perhaps even in the mitochondria. So the most potent pharmacologic agonist of that receptor is 125-dihydroxyvitamin D3. However, you don't have a lot of that. So even though 25-hydroxyvitamin D is less potent per dose, you have so much more of it that it actually stimulates that receptor in a way that's more biologically important. Like I said, 25-hydroxyvitamin D accounts for approximately 80% of the activity at the receptor, not because it's stronger, but because it's more abundant. However, D3 is also active at that same receptor, and if you spike, as you can see in my diagram, if you spike D3 levels, you're still going to impact that receptor, even though it's very, very weak. It's very, very weak. But what happens, for those of you who have actually studied pharmacology, what happens if you give a weak agonist in superabundance? If you flood the system with a weak agonist, what happens relative to the other more potent agonists? Well, they're all competing. So you've basically turned off the receptor by flooding the system with a weak agonist. Think about it. Some of you will understand it straight away. Some of you won't. You'll have to think about it some more. I'll say it one more time. If we flood the system with a weak activator, that actually blocks the more potent activators, like 25-hydroxyvitamin D and 125-dihydroxyvitamin D. So the vitamin D paradox that we see with a bolus dose is that it actually has a counterproductive effect. It's not giving them more, you're actually neutralizing the effect on the receptor. In addition to other things, like activating the vitamin D detoxification enzymes, which clear vitamin D from the system. So, again, you have to understand pharmacology in terms of receptor activation, ratios, and when you start to understand it in that way, as I've described here, you can pause the video to read the text. It's just bolus dosing is a complete disaster. And so you get the spike of an antagonist, but the body responds to that spike by producing or inducing the detoxification system for vitamin D to prevent vitamin D toxicity per se. And so you actually get a reduction in vitamin D levels more rapidly than would be achieved if you were to give that same amount of vitamin D over more time. So think about it, look at these graphs, read the text, and I think you'll understand it. I've talked about it in other videos. So what I'm going to show you right now is one of the biggest crimes committed by the medical mafia against humanity that I've ever seen in a single research article. As you would expect, this was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by the American Medical Association, and this is I guess this is, well, no. In the COVID era, we saw a lot of corrupt research. So this is, I want to say that this is the worst or the most corrupt ever, but maybe it doesn't even qualify for that anymore. Nonetheless, this is an example of absolute horrific medical corruption that looks like legitimate research for people who don't know how to read research. So if you think you know how to read research, you should read this article. Before you listen to my critique of it, you should read this article, even though, of course, now your interpretation would be tainted because I've already said it's one of the most corrupt articles I've ever read. You should read this article. If you think you're good at reading research, you should read this article before reading my critique and see how much corruption you can find in this article, because I found a lot. This is absolutely one of the most corrupt publications I've ever read in my life. So, one of the points that I made, I did publish a formal critique of this. It's available online. I'll provide it to you so you can see my itemized critique of this article. So, here's what they did. They gave these patients a single oral dose of 200,000 international units of vitamin D3. Why did they do that? I already showed you why. They did that because they knew that that was a failed strategy, but for people who are ignorant about vitamin D metabolism, which is most of the population of patients and doctors, they don't know that this is what's happening. The proper way to give vitamin D is to give it gradually. And if you need to get an acute response because you're dealing with an acute situation, the proper method is to give the active form, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, not the inactive form, which is D3, otherwise known as cholecalciferol. So this is exactly what they did in the JAMA study that we're about to look at, the one that I just said is the most corrupt that I've ever seen. this is what they did. And they knew it, and they published it anyway. So they knew that giving a bolus dose would appear like they're giving an aggressive dose, but it's counterproductive based on the pharmacology that I just showed you. Here's the other thing that you will never see in a legitimate study. They delayed treatment for at least 11, if not 14 days. So time from symptom onset to enrollment in the study was 10 days. So these patients were basically neglected for, I believe, 11 to 14 days before they were even enrolled in the study, let alone treated. So let's just use I'm going to give you two really good examples. Let's say that we're doing a study to test an anti-seizure drug against patients who are having status epilepticus. And we delayed treatment for 11 days. What would be the result? Well, first of all, most of those patients would be dead. Virtually all of those patients would be dead. Could we therefore conclude that the drug didn't work? Well, it obviously didn't work. All the patients were dead. No, but the reason that the patients are all dead and we've created the appearance that the drug didn't work is because we waited 11 days. Nothing's going to work after 11 days. That's example number one. Example number two, let's say we're talking about a different infectious disease, like an acute bacterial infection of some sort, whatever it is. Let's say we're talking about a bacterial or fungal infection with a known mortality, but we delay antimicrobial treatment for 11 days. And then we conclude that the drug didn't work. No journal in the world of any value would publish such a study. No journal in the world. But JAMA will happily publish a study using the same strategy because it made vitamin D look bad. As I state here, the vitamin D group was more sick than the placebo group, remarkably more sick. And so other data, I'll let you look at my critique of that I published back in 2021, I believe. It could have been 2022. All right, so since I'm the OG, the original gangster of vitamin D, I'm gonna show you what OG looks like. I'm gonna critique these comments. I just read these yesterday, and actually I didn't even read them. They were so absolutely stupid. But I'm going to read them right now. I read a few lines and I was like, God, this is just so stupid. But this is the level of stupidity that we see out there. So the quote that I excerpted above, truth, however, must meet with opposition and be able to fight. That's from Nietzsche. Henry David Thoreau actually said something very similar. Maybe he got it from Nietzsche. I don't know. Probably not.